You put me off my tempo. That's what you're for." The slap cracked across the music room like a dropped plate. Daisy Holt's head snapped sideways. Her cheek burned red in the shape of 4 fingers. She did not cry out. She did not fall. She stood very still, the way she had learned to stand, while 6 guests in silk and starch pretended not to watch. Lady Imogen Belchamber did not rise from her chair. She lifted her teacup instead and smiled at the room. "You see," she said, "the arrangement is working beautifully." A ripple of polite laughter went around the sofas. A fan opened. A spoon clinked against china. Nobody looked at the girl by the piano with the red mark rising on her face. Daisy Holt closed her eyes. Her lips moved. 3 notes, hummed so softly only the nearest ear could catch them. A waltz. Not a hymn, not a nursery rhyme. A waltz, low and sweet, the kind played in ballrooms she had never entered. In the doorway, an old woman in gray went white as bone china. Miss Phoebe Lund had trained 30 young ladies in her 40 years at Belchamber Court. She had buried her husband, her savings, and most of her illusions about the gentry. She thought she had heard every kind of cruelty a great house could produce. She had not expected to hear that waltz again. Not from that mouth. Not with that face. She had heard it once before, in another house, from another woman entirely. A woman she had been paid, many years ago, to forget. The teacup in Lady Imogen's hand did not shake, but somewhere in Sussex, in a locked drawer, in a dead man's ledger, a debt had just started counting itself again, and it would not stop until it had taken 2 estates, 1 engagement, and every word Lady Imogen Belchamber had ever said out loud about charity. But that comes later. First, you need to know how a girl becomes a thing that gets slapped for money. But before we continue, subscribe now and tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what time you saw this video. Tonight's story is one you will never forget. My name is Phoebe Lund. I am telling you this story because I was there for all of it, and because silence has a price, and I paid it once already. I will not pay it twice. It began, as these things always begin, with money that wasn't there. Daisy Holt was 17 years old in the spring of 1907, and she had one relative left in the world, an aunt, coughing blood into a handkerchief in 2 rented rooms above a chandler's shop in Lewes. The doctor wanted 4 shillings a week. Daisy had none. The parish offered a workhouse bed. Daisy refused it. Then a notice came, passed hand to hand through the village, worded so carefully it almost sounded kind. Wanted, young female, respectable, for companion service at Belchamber Court. Room, board, and 8 shillings weekly. Nervous disposition of the household requires a steady temperament. Nervous disposition, that was the word they used. Not slaps, not blows. Nervous disposition. Daisy walked 11 miles to the interview. She wore her only good coat, dark green wool, with a hem her mother had sewn thick and stiff, years before Daisy could remember her mother's face. She had always thought the stiffness was just old cloth, poorly cut. She never once thought to open it. Lady Imogen interviewed her in a room with more gold on the walls than Daisy had seen in her whole life. "You understand the position," Lady Imogen said. "Not quite a question. I understand I'm to attend Miss Oriana, my lady. You are to absorb Miss Oriana." Lady Imogen said it the way another woman might describe a recipe. "My daughter has a delicate constitution and an artistic temperament. When she is overwrought, she requires an outlet. You will be that outlet. In exchange, you are clothed, fed, housed, and paid 8 shillings a week. Do you find that objectionable?" Daisy thought of her aunt's cough. She thought of the workhouse gate. "No, my lady. Good girl." Lady Imogen smiled the smile of a woman closing a very good deal. "We feed her, clothe her, and she absorbs what Oriana's nerves produce. Everyone profits. Everyone profits." Daisy would hear that sentence 100 times before the year was out. She would hear it laughed at over dinner tables. She would hear it repeated to bishops and colonels and countesses as though it were a clever line from a play instead of a girl's face. She did not know. Standing in that gold room with her hands folded and her stomach hollow, that she was walking into a house that was hunting for her father without knowing she existed, and that the very slaps she was about to take, paid for like a service, were landing on a name older and higher than the Belchambers themselves. She only knew she needed the 8 shillings. The first slap came on her 3rd day. Oriana Belchamber was 19, golden-haired, and possessed of a temper her mother called spirit in company, and nothing at all in private, because in private Lady Imogen never once corrected her. Oriana had dropped a porcelain shepherdess. It shattered on the parquet floor into a dozen pale blue pieces. Lady Imogen's favorite piece, a wedding gift, irreplaceable. Who did this? Lady Imogen's voice cut through the drawing room like a blade drawn from a sheath. Oriana's chin trembled. A performance, Daisy would learn, that Oriana had practiced in mirrors. I don't know, Mama. I only turned, and it was gone. Lady Imogen turned her eyes to Daisy, standing by the window with a stack of linens in her arms. Holt, were you dusting that shelf? Daisy had not touched the shelf. She had not touched anything within 6 feet of the shepherdess. But she understood, in the half-second before she answered, exactly what was being asked of her, and exactly what would happen if she said no. Yes, my lady, she said. I'm sorry. Sorry does not mend china. Lady Imogen's mouth thinned. 1 shilling from your wages this week, and you will apologize to Miss Oriana for distressing her. Daisy turned to Oriana. Oriana's blue eyes were bright with something that was not quite guilt and not quite triumph, a flicker of both gone as fast as it came. I'm sorry, Miss Oriana, Daisy said. Oriana slapped her. It was not a hard blow. It was almost thoughtless, the way a woman flicks a fly from her sleeve. But it landed, and it stung, and Lady Imogen did not so much as glance up from her needlework. There now, Lady Imogen murmured. Nerves settled. Shall we have tea? Daisy stood with her cheek burning and the linen still in her arms, and she did not cry, because crying only ever made Oriana slap harder, faster, and twice. She had learned that on the first day. By the end of that first month, Daisy Holt had been slapped 9 times. She had been docked wages 4 times for things she had not done. She had learned to walk close to walls, to keep her eyes low in company, to disappear into doorways, the moment Oriana's voice climbed half a register. She had also learned, without deciding to, that if she hummed, very softly, just under her breath, 3 notes over and over, her hands stopped shaking after a blow landed. She did not know where the tune came from. She only knew it had always been there, somewhere behind her ribs, since before she could remember anything at all. She did not know it was a waltz her mother had danced to on her wedding night in a small stone chapel 18 years before, with a governess named Phoebe Lund standing witness in the second pew. The only guest, besides the groom's manservant, who had been permitted to attend a wedding the groom's own father was determined would never have happened at all. 12 miles from Belchamber Court, in a house called Ashcombe Hall, Duke Stephen Caraway sat alone in a study full of ledgers, searching for a grave. He was 45 years old, twice widowed, though only one of those marriages had ever been recorded in any church book that mattered to his family. He had a title, a fortune, a dead second wife whose portrait hung correctly and prominently in the long gallery, and a first wife whose name had been scrubbed so thoroughly from every register his father's lawyers could reach, that Stephen sometimes wondered, in his worst hours, whether he had dreamed her. He had not dreamed her. He had married her in secret at 26, against his father's iron will. And within a year, his father's men had found them, paid the vicar to alter the parish book, paid the witnesses to vanish, and told Stephen his wife had died of a fever in Calais, while he was made to sign papers he did not understand until it was far too late to stop them. He had never been shown a grave. He had asked for one once, in his 30s, and been told the Calais churchyard had flooded, the markers lost. He had believed it, because grief makes a man believe convenient things. He no longer believed it, For 6 months now he had been quietly retracing every step his father's lawyers had taken. Old bank drafts, old letters, a name here, a payment there, hunting not for a grave anymore, but for the truth of what his father had actually bought with all that money. He did not yet know there had been a child. He was about to be introduced, by his own solicitor and several eager mothers of the county, to Miss Oriana Belchamber, 19, golden, wealthy, and everyone assured him an ideal second beginning. Nobody told him the girl who would be slapped for Oriana's tantrums was the daughter he had spent 6 months hunting a grave for instead. Nobody told him, because nobody in that house knew it either, except one woman in gray who had recognized a waltz and had not yet decided whether she was brave enough to say so. The Duke's first visit to Belchamber Court came on a warm afternoon in April, and the house prepared for it the way an army prepares for a battle it intends to win by any means necessary. Lady Imogen had new curtains hung in the drawing room. She had the silver polished twice. She had Oriana fitted for a blue gown that matched her eyes, and she had every servant in the house briefed, in a tone that admitted no argument, that nothing was to disturb the impression of a calm, gentle, accomplished young lady. "Holt," Lady Imogen said to Daisy that morning in the corridor outside the kitchens, "you will keep to the back stairs while His Grace is here. You will not be seen. You will not be heard. Is that understood?" "Yes, my lady. If Miss Oriana requires you." Lady Imogen's eyes flicked briefly, coldly, toward the window, toward the sound of a carriage on gravel. "You will attend her quietly, and you will vanish the moment you are no longer required." A duke does not need to know how this house keeps its daughter calm. Daisy understood. She had understood for 2 months now that she was a secret the same way the coal cellar was a secret. Necessary, unglamorous, kept firmly out of sight of anyone who mattered. She did not yet understand that she was a far bigger secret than that. The Duke arrived at 3 o'clock in a motor car with the Caraway crest on the door, a hawk, wings spread, clutching a ring of keys, and Lady Imogen greeted him on the front steps with a warmth so bright it could have lit the whole county. "Your Grace, what an honor. Oriana has spoken of nothing else for a week." Oriana, behind her mother, dropped a curtsy so perfectly rehearsed it might have been drawn with a ruler. "Your Grace, welcome to Belchamber Court." Stephen Caraway bowed over her hand, said the correct things, admired the correct rooms, and felt, within 20 minutes, the particular tired weight of a man being sold something. He had felt it before. He would feel it many more times before the season ended. He had almost stopped noticing it. Then, somewhere above him, through a half-open door at the top of a back staircase he was not meant to see, he heard 3 notes hummed, low and soft, and his whole chest went cold. He knew that tune. He had not heard it in 19 years. He had heard it once, and only once, danced to it once, in a small stone chapel with a woman whose face he could still see perfectly on the nights he could not sleep. "Forgive me," he said, cutting across whatever Lady Imogen was saying about the East Wing's renovation. "Who is that? Humming?" Lady Imogen's smile did not move, but something behind her eyes recalculated very fast. "Humming, Your Grace? Just now, on the stair. A housemaid, I expect." Lady Imogen's laugh was light as spun sugar. "The girls do chatter while they work. I'll have a word." "No need," Stephen said, though something in him wanted very badly to see the stair, to see the doorway, to see who had hummed a dead woman's waltz in a house he had never visited before today. He let it go. He was a careful man, and careful men do not chase housemaids' tunes in front of the mothers angling to marry their daughters to them. But he did not forget it. And that night, back at Ashcombe Hall, he wrote one line in the ledger where he kept his search for the truth about his first wife. "Belchamber Court. A tune. Look again." Lady Imogen watched the Duke's motor car disappear down the drive, and she stood very still on the front steps for a long moment, thinking. She had heard the humming too. She had recognized the sudden stillness in the Duke's face, the way a man's whole body changes when a ghost brushes past him. She did not know what the tune meant to him. She only knew, with the sharp instinct of a woman who had spent 20 years managing other people's attention, that something in her house had briefly stolen his focus from her daughter, and she would not permit it to happen twice. She summoned Daisy to the small parlor within the hour. "You were humming today." Daisy's stomach dropped. I didn't mean to be heard, my lady." "You were heard." Lady Imogen's voice was calm, which was somehow worse than shouting. His Grace asked after it, "Do you understand what that means?" "No, my lady. It means you drew his attention when every ounce of that attention belongs to Miss Oriana." Lady Imogen rose, smoothed her skirts, and looked at Daisy the way a woman looks at a stain she is deciding whether to bother removing. "You will be more careful, or you will be gone before the engagement is announced. I have kept girls like you before, Holt. I can replace you inside a week." Daisy bowed her head. "Yes, my lady." "One more service," Lady Imogen said, already turning away, already thinking of curtains and menus and the exact shade of blue that suited her daughter's eyes. "The engagement ball. You'll attend Oriana there, dress her, steady her, do what you're paid to do. After that," she waved a hand, as if brushing crumbs from a table, "we shall see about your tone." Daisy left the parlor with her heart hammering, and her wages again, docked half a shilling for the crime of humming her own mother's song. She went up to the small attic room she shared with 2 other maids, and she sat on the edge of her narrow bed, and she did what she always did when the day had taken more from her than she had left to give. She took off her coat, dark green wool, worn thin at the elbows now, and she ran her thumb along the hem, feeling, as she always felt without understanding, the stiff ridge of something sewn inside the cloth. Tonight, for the first time, she wondered what it was. She was still wondering 3 weeks later. On the afternoon, a garden party humiliated her in front of 40 guests instead of 6. And on the afternoon, Phoebe Lund finally decided she could not carry her silence one more season. The garden party was Lady Imogen's second performance for the Duke, and this time she had built an audience. 40 guests spread across the south lawn under white awnings. County families, a bishop, 2 colonels, a scattering of eligible young men brought along as camouflage for the real business of the day, which was placing Oriana Belchamber directly and repeatedly in front of Duke Stephen Caraway until the shape of an engagement became, in the minds of everyone present, simply inevitable. Oriana wore white muslin and carried a parasol she had practiced twirling in the mirror for 2 days. She laughed at everything the Duke said, whether or not it was funny. She quoted poetry she did not understand. She was, by every outward measure, exactly the ornament her mother had built her to be. Daisy stood at the edge of the lawn near the refreshment table, in her plain gray uniform, refilling teacups, invisible the way she had been trained to be invisible. It held for 2 hours. Then Oriana, reaching for a strawberry tart, knocked an entire pitcher of lemonade off the table and onto the hem of Lady Fenwick's silk gown. Lady Fenwick gasped. Guests turned. A dozen conversations stopped mid-sentence. Oriana's face went from horror to calculation in under a second. Daisy had watched her make that exact turn 100 times now, and she still, every single time, felt her stomach fall through the ground. "Holt did it," Oriana said, loud enough for the whole lawn. She jostled the table. "I saw her." Every eye on the south lawn moved to Daisy. "I'm so sorry, Lady Fenwick," Daisy said, because there was nothing else to say, because 40 witnesses had just watched a lie become the truth simply by being spoken with confidence in front of them. Lady Imogen crossed the lawn with the smooth, unhurried speed of a woman handling an emergency she has handled many times before. "Careless girl," she said, not to Daisy, but to the crowd, in the tone of an explanation, to the bishop, to the colonels, to the Duke standing 3 feet away with his jaw very tight. "This is precisely why we keep her. Oriana's constitution cannot bear disorder. A companion absorbs it, so the family need not." "Absorbs it," repeated one of the colonels, chuckling, not unkindly, simply because he did not understand what the words meant when applied to a human face. We feed her, clothe her, and she takes what spills over, Lady Imogen said, warming to her audience now, the way she always did. It is really a form of charity if one thinks about it. The girl would be in a workhouse otherwise. Polite laughter rippled across the lawn. A few guests nodded, genuinely persuaded that they had just heard a description of kindness. The Duke did not laugh. He was watching Daisy's face, the careful blankness of it, the practiced stillness, the way her chin lifted a half-inch as if bracing for a blow that had not yet come. And something in his own chest, some old wound he could not name, went very quiet and very cold. "Apologize to her ladyship, Holt," Lady Imogen said. Daisy turned to Oriana, expecting to say sorry to the girl standing beside her, as she always did. But Oriana, embarrassed now by the size of the crowd her lie had gathered, and unwilling to be outdone in performance by her own mother, reached out and slapped Daisy across the face. Hard, harder than usual, hard enough that Daisy's head turned and a gasp ran down the length of the lawn like a lit fuse. "There," Oriana said, breathless, chin high. "Now we're settled." The Duke's hand had moved, not far, not enough for anyone to say later that he had done anything at all. But his fingers had curled once, and his jaw had gone tight enough that a muscle jumped along it, and Lady Imogen, watching him sideways, saw something in his face that made her stomach turn cold for the first time all afternoon. It was not admiration. It was not amusement. It was the look of a man filing something away, carefully, permanently, to be used later. She did not know what he was thinking. She only knew, suddenly and sharply, that her performance had cost her something, though she could not yet say what. She was right to be afraid. She simply did not know how right. Because 40 feet away, at the edge of the lawn, an old woman in gray stood with a tray of empty glasses forgotten in her hands, staring at Daisy Holt's face the way a woman stares at a photograph of someone she buried long ago. Miss Phoebe Lund had served as governess to 3 generations of gentry, and she had learned over 4 decades exactly how much of the truth a servant could afford to speak. The answer, almost always, was none of it. But she had known Daisy Holt's mother, not as a rumor, not as a name in an old ledger. She had known her, taught her, danced with her at her own secret wedding as the only witness on the bride's side, because the bride's side had consisted of no one else at all. Her name had been Eleanor. Eleanor Gray before she became, for 11 brief months, Eleanor Carraway. Phoebe had been governess in the household of Stephen Carraway's own aunt, where Eleanor had served as a lady's companion, the same low, invisible post Daisy now held at Belchamber Court, though Phoebe had not made that connection yet. Not fully, not until she watched Daisy hum a waltz on a back stair 3 weeks ago, and felt the floor tilt under her feet. She had taught Eleanor that waltz herself one winter afternoon in a cold parlor, humming it over and over until Eleanor's clumsy feet found the rhythm. She had watched Eleanor and Stephen Carraway fall in love across a piano bench. Neither of them was supposed to be sharing. She had stood witness in a small stone chapel outside Calais when they married in secret against his father's will. And she had been the one, she, Phoebe Lund, no one else, who was found 6 weeks later by the old Duke's lawyers, handed an envelope thick with banknotes, and told, in a tone that admitted no negotiation, that Eleanor Carraway had died of a fever, that the marriage had never legally existed, that Phoebe's silence was worth more to her future employment than any truth could ever be worth to her conscience. She had taken the money. She had signed the paper. She had told herself, for 19 years, that Eleanor was truly dead, because it was easier to grieve a lie than to live with what she had actually done. She had never once been told there was a child. Standing on that lawn, watching Daisy Holt's cheek redden under Oriana Belchamber's hand, watching the girl hum 3 low notes to steady her own shaking fingers, Phoebe Lund understood, all at once and completely, that she had been paid 19 years ago to erase a woman who had left something behind after all. Her tray shook in her hands. A glass slid, tipped, shattered on the flagstones. Nobody noticed. Nobody was looking at the old governess. Everyone was looking at Daisy. That was, Phoebe would think later, the precise shape of the tragedy. That a girl could stand at the center of the largest secret in 3 counties and be the only person on the lawn nobody thought worth watching. She did not speak that day. She told herself she needed proof. She told herself she needed time. She told herself, if she was honest, that she was afraid of losing the roof over her own head, afraid of being called a liar by a family with the money to make any accusation against her disappear, afraid of the particular poverty that comes to old women who have spent their lives serving other people's children and saved nothing of their own. She had been paid for silence once. She was terrified, now, of what it would cost her to finally break it. That night, alone in her small room, Phoebe Lund took out a wooden box she had not opened in 19 years. Inside it, a folded handkerchief embroidered with the initial E, a pressed flower, brown and brittle, from a chapel doorway in Calais, and a receipt, yellowed and creased, for £200, signed by a lawyer long since dead, for services rendered. She read the receipt 3 times. Then she put the box away, and she did not sleep. 12 miles distant, in his own study, Duke Stephen Caraway was awake too, going through his father's old bank ledgers by lamplight, tracing a payment of £200 made 19 years ago to a governess named P. Lund. He did not yet know why the name mattered. He only knew, with the same cold instinct that had made his hand curl into a fist on a sunlit lawn that afternoon, that he was closer to an answer than he had been in 6 months of searching, and that the answer was somehow tangled up with a housemaid's humming and a slap he could not stop thinking about. Meanwhile, in her narrow attic bed, Daisy Holt finally opened the hem of her mother's coat. She had waited until her roommates were asleep. She worked a hairpin along the stiff seam by candlelight, her fingers clumsy, her heart beating too fast for a tax that was, she told herself, probably nothing, old thread, old wadding, nothing worth the trouble. The hem gave way. A folded paper slid into her palm, soft with age, creased so many times it had gone thin as silk at the folds. She opened it carefully. Marriage lines, a church record, torn, not officially copied, but torn, actually torn from a register, the jagged edge still visible along one side, as if someone had ripped it out in haste and given it to a frightened young wife to keep hidden, in case the copy in the church itself was ever altered or destroyed. 2 names, in faded ink: Eleanor Gray, Stephen Caraway. Daisy stared at the second name for a long time. She did not know it. She had no reason to know it. She had never once been told her father's name, only that her mother had died when Daisy was an infant, and that an aunt in Lewes had raised her out of duty and dwindling charity ever since. She folded the paper back along its creases, tucked it beneath her pillow, and lay awake a long time, humming 3 notes very softly into the dark, not understanding yet what she was holding, only that it was hers, and that it was the only thing of her mother's she had ever truly touched. She did not know she was holding the exact document that would, within 6 weeks, end an engagement, expose a scheme, and hand her a title in front of 200 witnesses. She only knew, for the first time in 2 months at Belchamber Court, that she had a secret of her own, and it felt, strangely, like the first thing in her whole life that no one could slap out of her hands. The engagement ball was set for the 2nd Saturday in June, and Belchamber Court spent the intervening weeks in a fever of preparation that left no room, none at all, for anyone to notice a housemaid growing quieter, more watchful, more careful with the folded paper she now carried sewn into a fresh hiding place at all times. 200 guests were invited. The ballroom was hung with white roses. An orchestra was engaged from London. Lady Imogen ordered a gown for Oriana in caraway blue, a shade. She informed everyone who would listen, chosen to flatter His Grace's family colors, though in truth she had simply asked his tailor which blue he favored, and then bought every bolt of it in the county. This, Lady Imogen told Oriana, the night before the ball, adjusting the gown's shoulder with brisk, satisfied hands, is the night the world understands exactly what you are worth. Oriana looked at herself in the mirror, golden and gleaming and utterly certain of her own inevitability. And after the ball, Mama, the announcement? After the ball, the engagement is as good as signed. Lady Imogen's smile did not reach her eyes. It never quite did. His Grace has been circling for months. Tomorrow he lands. She turned, on her way out of the room, and addressed a thought almost as an afterthought, the kind of decision made in passing, the way one decides to discard a worn glove. Holt attends you at the ball. One last service. After the engagement is announced, I want her gone by the end of the week. Her tone has grown unsuitable. Gone where? Oriana asked, not out of concern, simply out of idle curiosity, the way one asks what happens to old newspapers. Not my concern. Lady Imogen was already at the door. There are always more girls who need the wages. Down the corridor, close enough to hear every word through a door left carelessly ajar, Daisy Holt stood with an armful of linens and did not move, did not breathe, until Lady Imogen's footsteps had faded entirely down the marble stair. Gone by the end of the week. There are always more girls. She thought of her aunt's cough. She thought of 8 shillings a week, and how thin the margin was between that and nothing at all. She thought, for one bitter moment, of simply running that night, of taking the folded paper under her pillow and walking to wherever it might lead her, away from this house and its slaps and its smiling cruelty forever. But her aunt needed medicine on Monday, and Daisy Holt, whatever else she was, had never once in her life been given the luxury of running from a debt before it was paid. She would stand at the ball. She would do her duty one last time. She did not know, could not have known, that the duty she was about to perform would be the last slap Oriana Belchamber ever landed on anyone in her life, and that it would be witnessed by every person who mattered in 3 counties at once. The night of the ball, Belchamber Court blazed with light from every window, and 200 carriages lined the drive. Inside, the ballroom glittered. Chandeliers doubled in gilt mirrors. White roses banked along every wall, the orchestra tuning in the gallery above. County families arrived in waves. The Fenwicks, the Colonels, the bishop and his wife, half the peerage within 30 miles, all come to watch a duke choose his bride. Duke Stephen Caraway arrived at 9, in full evening dress, his face composed into the careful blankness of a man performing a role he had not fully agreed to. He had spent the afternoon in his study, and he had finally, after weeks of tracing old payments through his father's ledgers, found the second document he needed, a letter folded inside an old account book from his father's own hand, referring obliquely to the Gray Girl's issue and instructing the family solicitor to ensure no claim is ever raised against the estate on the child's behalf. The child. He had read that phrase perhaps 40 times since finding it. He had not slept in 2 days. He had come to the ball tonight not to court Oriana Belchamber, but because he did not yet know where else to look, and because some instinct he could not name told him the answer was somewhere inside these walls. He was right. He simply did not yet know how close. Daisy stood at the edge of the ballroom in her plain gray, dressing pins still tucked in her apron from settling Oriana's hair an hour before, watching the golden heiress spin through her first dances with a practiced, radiant smile that had cost her mother a fortune to arrange. The quadrille began at 10:30. Oriana danced beautifully, or nearly. She had been drilled for weeks, every step counted and corrected, but somewhere in the third figure, turning too fast in her excitement, in her hunger to be perfect in front of the man who was about to make her a duchess, she missed her mark. Her heel caught the hem of her gown. She stumbled badly in front of 200 watching guests, and for one horrible half-second, the whole room saw the golden heiress nearly fall on her own ballroom floor. Laughter, quick, cruel, instantly suppressed, rippled from somewhere near the punch table. Oriana's face went scarlet. Old habit, drilled deeper than any dance step, took over before thought could stop it. She turned. She saw Daisy at the edge of the floor, close enough, familiar enough, the one person in the room she had struck 100 times before, without consequence. Her hand rose. The whole ballroom seemed to lean in without moving. The Duke's hand closed around her wrist in midair. He had crossed the floor without anyone quite seeing him move. His fingers held Oriana's wrist exactly where it had stopped, 6 inches from Daisy's face, and the entire ballroom went silent so completely that the orchestra, mid-phrase, simply stopped, one instrument after another dying out like candles pinched between fingers. "Your Grace!" Oriana's voice cracked, mortified, furious, frightened all at once. "Madam," Stephen Caraway said, very quietly, in a voice that somehow carried to every corner of a room built for 200 people, "I have caught exactly one thing in this house worth keeping." He did not let go of her wrist. He turned his head, slowly, to look at Daisy Holt for the first time, not as a housemaid, but as a person. Pale, shaking, her cheek already flinching in anticipation of a blow that had never landed. And Daisy, trembling, not even aware she was doing it, hummed 3 low notes to steady her own racing heart. The Duke's whole body went still. He released Oriana's wrist as if it had turned to ice in his hand. He stepped toward Daisy. One step, then another, the entire ballroom holding its breath around him. And, in a voice that cracked with something none of the guests had ever heard from him before, he finished the phrase aloud, humming the next 3 notes of the waltz Daisy had just begun. Gasps ran down the length of the ballroom like a lit fuse touching powder. "Who taught you that tune?" the Duke asked, and his voice was not steady at all now. Tell me who taught you that?" Daisy's mouth opened. Nothing came out. She did not know. She had never known. It was simply hers, the way her own heartbeat was hers. A thing that had always lived somewhere behind her ribs since before memory began. It was Phoebe Lund who answered, stepping out from the wall of watching servants. Governesses gray against a sea of silk and jewels. An old woman 200 guests had spent the whole evening looking straight through. Her voice shook, but it did not stop. "Your Grace." She had rehearsed this sentence for 19 years without ever once daring to say it aloud, and now it came out of her plain and unadorned, the way the truth so often does when it finally arrives too late to be softened. The waltz was her mother's. I taught it to her myself, and I stood witness, the only witness, at your wedding in the chapel outside Calais, 18 years ago this June. The silence that followed was not the silence of 200 polite guests pretending not to listen. It was the silence of 200 people understanding, all at once, that they were watching history rewrite itself in real time. "Eleanor," the Duke said, and the name came out of him broken, the way a man says a word he has kept locked in a box for 2 decades. "You knew Eleanor." "I knew Eleanor Gray," Phoebe said, "and I have spent 19 years believing she died with no one left behind her. I was wrong. I was paid to be wrong, Your Grace, by your own father's lawyers, and I have carried that money like a stone in my chest every day since." Lady Imogen had gone the color of old wax. This is servants' gossip, Your Grace. Some confusion, some. "I have the receipt," Phoebe said, and did not look at Lady Imogen at all. £200. Signed. I kept it 19 years, because some part of me always knew the day would come. I'd need to prove I hadn't imagined the whole thing. Daisy, shaking so hard now she could barely control her own hands, reached into the fresh hiding place she had sewn into her sleeve that very afternoon, a habit born of instinct she had not fully understood until this exact second, and drew out a folded paper, soft with age, its edge torn where it had once been ripped from a church register in haste. She held it out. Her voice, when it came, was smaller than she wanted it to be, but it did not shake. "My mother sewed this into my coat," she said. "I only found it 3 weeks ago. I didn't know what it meant." The Duke unfolded it with hands that were not steady at all. He read two names in faded ink, Eleanor Gray, Stephen Caraway, and something in his face broke open completely in front of the largest, most powerful audience Sussex could assemble in one room. "You're my daughter," he said. And it was not a question. It was a man finally, after 6 months of hunting a grave, finding something infinitely more alive. Nobody in that ballroom breathed for a long moment. Then the Duke turned, slowly, deliberately. Every inch the man who had spent 25 years learning exactly how to make a room understand precisely what he meant, and looked at Lady Imogen Belchamber for the first time all evening as something other than a courteous stranger. "You hired my daughter," he said, "to be slapped in place of yours. Your Grace, I assure you, we had no possible way to know. We feed her, clothe her, and she absorbs what Oriana's nerves produce." The Duke repeated Lady Imogen's own words back to her, exactly, in the same tone she had once used to explain them to a laughing garden party. "Everyone profits. Isn't that what you told your guests, Lady Imogen? Weren't those your very words in this house, in front of a bishop and 2 colonels, while my daughter's face went red under your daughter's hand?" Lady Imogen's mouth opened. No sound came out. 200 guests who had, weeks earlier, laughed politely at that exact sentence over lemonade, and strawberry tarts now stood in absolute silence, watching it land on the woman who had coined it, word for word, with nowhere left to hide from it. "Every wage you docked from her for crimes your own daughter committed," the Duke went on, his voice gaining a terrible, level calm. "Every slap you called an arrangement, every insult you dressed up as charity. My solicitors will itemize every one of them, Lady Imogen, and you will answer for them as what they were. Not discipline, not custom. Assault committed against a duke's daughter, purchased and applauded in your own drawing room for the better part of a season." A gasp ran the length of the ballroom, not the small, suppressed gasp of scandal, but a long, rolling wave of sound, chairs scraping, fans snapping shut, a bishop clearing his throat into a silence too large to fill. Oriana Belchamber stood frozen in the center of the dance floor, still in her caraway blue gown, her raised hand now hanging useless and forgotten at her side, watching her entire engagement, her entire future, dissolve in front of every family whose good opinion she had been raised, from the cradle, to crave above anything else in the world. The Duke turned to her last, and his voice, when it came, held none of the fury he had shown her mother, only something colder and far more final. "You struck a girl 100 times, Miss Belchamber, because it cost you nothing, and because you were told by your own mother that it never would." He paused and let the whole room feel the weight of what was coming. "I am going to offer you a position in my household on precisely the terms your family designed for my daughter. Companion service. Room and board. You will absorb what my temper produces, whenever it produces it, and everyone, as your mother liked to say, will profit." The silence after that sentence was the loudest sound in the ballroom all night. Every person present understood exactly what he meant, and exactly why he would never, not for one moment, actually make her live it. The offer itself was the punishment, spoken once, in front of everyone Oriana had ever wanted to impress, so that she would carry the shape of it for the rest of her life the way Daisy had carried the shape of every slap. Oriana did not answer. She could not. Tears ran silently down a face that had been trained, for 19 years, never to show a genuine emotion in public, and now showed nothing but genuine ones all at once, with nowhere left to hide them. Lady Imogen reached for her daughter's arm, and Oriana, for the first time in her life, flinched away from her mother's touch in front of witnesses. The orchestra did not resume. Nobody asked it to. 200 guests simply began, slowly, to whisper. Dying murmurs running table to table, chair to chair, the particular hush of a scandal too enormous to discuss above a breath, while in the center of it all, Duke Stephen Caraway knelt in front of the entire county and took his daughter's shaking hands in his. "I am sorry," he said, so quietly it was almost only for her. "I am so sorry it took me this long. Daisy Holt, who 3 months ago had walked 11 miles to be interviewed for a position that would pay her 8 shillings a week to be struck for another girl's sins, stood in the middle of a ballroom that had gone entirely silent for her, and finally, for the first time since her mother died, allowed herself to cry in front of witnesses because for the first time in her life, nobody in the room was going to make her pay for it. The weeks that followed moved fast, the way weeks always do once the truth has finally been let out of its box. The Duke's solicitors descended on Belchamber Court within days, and what they found, once they went looking, was worse than even the ballroom had guessed. 3 years of docked wages, false accusations, and physical punishment, all documented in the household's own account books, kept with the careless confidence of people who had never once imagined being asked to explain themselves. Lady Imogen fought it, at first, the way proud people always fight the thing that is already lost. Threats of countersuit, appeals to old friendships, letters to the bishop begging him to speak on the family's behalf. The bishop, who had laughed politely at a garden party 3 months earlier and had thought of little else since, declined. In the end, the Belchambers settled everything the Duke's lawyers demanded. Every shilling repaid tenfold, a public retraction printed in 3 county papers, and Belchamber Court itself, mortgaged to the roofline within a year, sold at auction to pay debts that had been quietly accumulating long before Daisy Holt ever walked through its gates. Oriana Belchamber did not become a Duke's companion. Nobody had ever expected her to. She left the county entirely within the year, to live, reduced and quiet, with an aunt in the north, and the last anyone at Belchamber Court heard of her, she had not been invited to a single ball since. Duke Stephen Caraway had his daughter's name entered, formally, properly, into the family register at Ashcombe Hall. Not Daisy Holt any longer, but Lady Margaret Daisy Caraway, firstborn and only living child of the Duke, with a claim on the estate that no lawyer, living or dead, could ever again erase. She was given rooms with windows that faced the garden. She was given a wardrobe she did not have to earn with bruises. She was given, most of all, something she had never once expected in her whole life. A father who asked her, every single evening for the first month, whether she was warm enough, fed enough, safe enough, as though he were still catching up on 18 years of questions he had never been allowed to ask. Miss Phoebe Lund was not dismissed, and she was not forgotten. The Duke pensioned her with full honors, a cottage on the Ashcombe grounds, and a standing invitation to dine at his table whenever she wished. An old woman who had been paid once to erase the truth, now paid, for the rest of her life, for having finally told it. Daisy, Lady Margaret now, though she asked her father, quietly, if she might still be called Daisy at home, had one more thing to settle before she considered the story finished. Her father's solicitors, flush with the momentum of total victory, wanted to pursue the Belchambers to absolute ruin. Criminal charges, public disgrace beyond what had already fallen, every last shilling and every last shred of standing stripped from the family that had struck her 100 times and called it charity. Daisy said no. "They hurt me," she told her father, standing in the Ashcombe garden on a warm evening in late summer, "and I will never forget it. But I remember needing that position, Papa. I remember what it is to need 8 shillings so badly you'll let someone hit you for it. I don't want anyone else standing where I stood, watching a family lose everything, and thinking that's what happens to people who fall." The Duke studied his daughter for a long moment. This girl who had absorbed 3 years of cruelty meant for someone else, and who now, with the power to destroy the people who had done it, chose instead to simply let them fall as far as their own choices had already carried them, and no further. "You are," he said finally, "very much your mother's daughter. Cruelty always lands on someone, and that someone is always more than the people who hurt her ever bothered to find out. Here is the question we leave you with tonight. Daisy spared the Belchambers a complete and total ruin, because she remembered what it was to need their wages badly enough to bear their cruelty. Was that mercy? The mark of a woman larger than the family that tried to break her? Or was it a debt of fear she should have, finally, fully outgrown, the last small slap she let them keep? Tell us what you believe in the comments below. This is Dukes and Duchesses, where every story is told the way it deserves to be told. Subscribe now, share this with someone today, and tell us in the comments which moment hit you the hardest. We will see you for the next story. It is already waiting.